Where are you right now? Midnight? 3 in the morning? Somewhere between exhausted and oddly fascinated by the strangest questions that pop into your head when you should be sleeping? Perfect. You're in exactly the right place. Go ahead, settle in, maybe grab a snack, because tonight we're traveling back to a kitchen that had no walls, no stove, no refrigerator, and definitely no Uber Eats. We're stepping into the original culinary world, where every meal was an adventure and every bite was earned through knowledge, skill, and sometimes sheer luck. This is your quiet corner of the internet, where we explore the forgotten arts of survival, the ancient rhythms of human ingenuity, and the incredible story of how our ancestors turned raw, wild ingredients into the foundation of civilization itself. If you've ever wondered how humans survived before grocery stores, before agriculture, before anyone even dreamed of a microwave, then this might just become your new obsession. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to discover something extraordinary. This isn't just about food. This is about the birth of cooking, the dawn of flavor, and the incredible journey from fire and stone to the meal you had for dinner tonight. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into human history, a like and subscribe helps more people stumble across these stories. No pressure, just appreciation for curiosity that runs this deep. Now, let's begin. Picture this: no grocery stores, no farmers markets, no delivery apps, no salt shakers, no spice racks, no measuring cups, no ovens, no stovetops, no microwaves, just you, your family, the landscape around you, and an empty stomach that demands to be filled. This was reality for our ancestors for over 99% of human history, and somehow, not only did they survive, they created the foundation of every cooking technique, every flavor combination, every food tradition we know today. The story of how early humans prepared their food is the story of ingenuity, born from necessity, of trial and error written in smoke and ash, of knowledge passed down through generations, not in cookbooks, but in careful observation and patient practice. It's a story that begins with raw meat and wild plants and evolves into something that would make a modern chef weep with admiration. But here's what most people don't realize about prehistoric cooking. It wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated, complex, and required an understanding of chemistry, biology, and physics that would impress any culinary school graduate today. These weren't cavemen grunting over hunks of raw meat. These were master food scientists who understood fermentation, smoking, roasting, steaming, and preservation techniques that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. The first and most revolutionary moment in human culinary history happened somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, and it changed everything. Not agriculture, not the invention of pottery, not even the development of tools. Fire. The controlled use of fire didn't just give our ancestors warmth and protection from predators. It unlocked the nutritional potential of food in ways that transformed our species forever. Think about what fire actually does to food at a molecular level. It breaks down tough plant fibers, making previously inedible roots and tubers not just edible but digestible. It denatures proteins in meat, making them easier to chew and absorb. It kills harmful bacteria and parasites that could cause illness or death. And perhaps most importantly, it dramatically increases the caloric availability of food, giving our ancestors the energy surplus they needed to develop larger brains and more complex societies. The earliest evidence of controlled fire use by human ancestors dates back nearly 2 million years, found in sites across Africa. But controlling fire and cooking with fire are two very different skills. The archaeological record suggests that systematic cooking, the kind that requires planning and technique, began appearing around 400,000 years ago. This timing isn't coincidental. It corresponds with significant increases in brain size and the development of more sophisticated tool technologies. But how exactly did they do it? How do you cook without pots, pans, or any of the equipment we consider essential today? The answer lies in understanding that early humans were masters of using natural materials as cooking vessels and tools. They didn't need metal pots because they had animal stomachs. They didn't need ceramic dishes because they had large leaves, hollowed-out gourds, and carefully shaped pieces of bark. They didn't need ovens because they understood how to create and control different types of fires and cooking environments. Let's start with the simplest method, direct fire cooking. This is what most people imagine when they think of prehistoric cooking. Meat skewered on a stick, held over flames until charred on the outside, and cooked through. But even this, apparently simple technique required sophisticated knowledge. Our ancestors had to understand which woods burned at the right temperature, how to maintain consistent heat, how to position food for even cooking, and most crucially, how to tell when something was properly cooked without thermometers or timers. They learned that different types of wood produced different flavors. Oak burned hot and clean, perfect for searing meat quickly. Fruit woods like apple or cherry burned cooler, but added subtle sweetness. Pine and other resinous woods were avoided for cooking because they could make food taste bitter or even toxic. This wasn't information they could look up in a manual. It was knowledge earned through generations of experimentation, observation, and sometimes painful mistakes. The positioning of food over fire was an art form in itself. Too close to the flames and the outside would char while the inside remained raw. Too far away and the food would never cook through. They developed techniques for creating different heat zones within a single fire, using the coals for steady, moderate heat and the flames for quick searing. They understood how to bank fires with stones to create reflective heat surfaces, and how to dig cooking pits that would maintain temperature for hours. But direct fire cooking was just the beginning. Early humans quickly discovered that some of the most nutritious and important foods couldn't be cooked this way. Tough roots, fibrous plant matter, and certain types of meat required different approaches. This led to the development of what archaeologists call earth oven cooking, a technique so effective that it's still used by indigenous peoples around the world today. An earth oven is exactly what it sounds like. A cooking chamber dug into the ground and lined with stones. But the sophistication required to build and operate one successfully is staggering. First, you need to select the right type of stones. Certain rocks, like river stones that have absorbed water, can explode when heated. Others, like some types of limestone, can crack and crumble. The ideal stones are dense, dry, and heat-resistant, often found in specific geological formations that our ancestors learned to identify. The construction process begins with digging a pit, usually circular, and anywhere from 2 to 6 feet across, depending on how much food needs to be cooked. The bottom of the pit is lined with carefully selected stones. Then a fire is built directly on top of these stones and maintained for several hours. This isn't a quick process. The stones need to absorb enough heat to maintain cooking temperature for many hours after the fire is extinguished. Once the stones are properly heated, the fire is carefully removed, and the cooking process begins. Food is wrapped in large leaves, animal hides, or layers of grass to protect it from direct contact with the hot stones, and to create a steaming environment. The wrapped food is placed on the heated stones, then covered with more protective materials, and finally sealed under layers of earth to trap the heat and moisture. The result is food that's been slow cooked at consistent temperature for 8 to 12 hours or more. Tough roots become tender and sweet. Fibrous plant materials break down into digestible nutrients. Large cuts of meat cook evenly throughout while retaining moisture and developing complex flavors. It's essentially a primitive version of sous vide cooking, achieving results that would impress any modern chef. But earth oven cooking required more than just technical knowledge. It demanded understanding of timing, weather, and seasonal availability of materials. The large leaves used for wrapping were only available at certain times of year. The specific plants that provided the best insulation and flavor varied by region and season. Most importantly, this type of cooking required community coordination. Building and operating an earth oven was typically a group effort, requiring multiple people to gather materials, tend the fire, and manage the complex timing involved. This communal aspect of prehistoric cooking is something we often overlook but shouldn't underestimate. Food preparation wasn't just about nutrition. It was about social bonding, knowledge transfer, and cultural identity. The techniques for selecting, preparing, and cooking food were passed down through generations, not through written recipes, but through careful observation and hands-on practice. Children learned by watching their elders, by helping with simple tasks, and gradually taking on more complex responsibilities. The knowledge required was encyclopedic. Which plants were edible and which were poisonous? Which parts of animals were best for different cooking methods? How to preserve food for lean times? How to combine different ingredients for maximum nutrition and flavor? How to adapt cooking techniques to different seasons and available resources? This wasn't just cooking. It was survival science, passed down through an unbroken chain of human experience, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. And we're just getting started. Because while fire revolutionized human food preparation, it was only the beginning of our ancestors' culinary innovations. They developed techniques for cooking without fire, methods for preserving food that could last for months, and flavor combinations that would influence human cuisine for millennia to come. The techniques for cooking without fire might sound impossible, but our ancestors mastered methods that would leave modern survivalists speechless. When flames weren't available, when wood was scarce, or when stealth was necessary to avoid attracting predators or rival groups, early humans turned to the sun, hot stones, and their own ingenuity to transform raw ingredients into nourishing meals. Stone boiling represents one of the most elegant solutions to a seemingly impossible problem. How do you boil water without a metal pot? The answer lies in understanding that heat can be transferred, that stones can become portable stoves, and that animal hides or tightly woven baskets can hold water if you're clever enough. The process begins with heating stones in a fire until they're radiating intense heat. Using wooden tongs or split sticks, these scorching rocks are then carefully transferred into water-filled containers. The physics are beautiful in their simplicity. The superheated stone transfers its thermal energy to the water, bringing it to a rolling boil within minutes. As each stone cools, it's replaced with another hot one, maintaining the boiling temperature for as long as needed. This technique allowed our ancestors to cook stews, extract nutrients from bones, and purify questionable water sources. Archaeological evidence from sites across North America, Europe, and Asia shows collections of fire-cracked rocks that tell the story of countless meals prepared this way. But stone boiling was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Early humans understood that cooking wasn't just about applying heat. It was about controlling moisture, managing time, and manipulating the chemical processes that transform raw ingredients into digestible nutrition. They discovered that wrapping food in wet leaves and burying it in hot sand created a steaming environment that could cook delicate fish or tender vegetables without the intense heat that might destroy their nutritional value. They learned that certain combinations of plants and meat weren't just more flavorful together, they were more nutritious. The vitamin C in fresh berries helped their bodies absorb iron from cooked meat. The natural acids in some fruits helped break down tough plant fibers when mixed with root vegetables. These weren't conscious decisions based on scientific understanding, but patterns noticed over generations of careful observation and experimentation. The development of smoking techniques represents perhaps the most sophisticated prehistoric food technology. Smoking wasn't just about preservation, though that was crucially important. It was about creating complex flavors, controlling moisture content, and developing foods that could be stored for months without spoiling. The process required understanding wind patterns, wood selection, temperature control, and timing within precision that would challenge modern pitmasters. Cold smoking, performed at temperatures below 90 degrees, could preserve fish and meat for months while maintaining their nutritional value and creating flavors that enhanced rather than masked the natural taste of the food. The difference between these techniques wasn't just temperature, it was understanding the fundamental chemistry of preservation and flavor development. Our ancestors built sophisticated smoking structures using nothing but natural materials, framework of green wood that wouldn't burn, walls of bark or hide to control airflow, and carefully designed ventilation systems that maintained optimal temperature and smoke density. They understood that different woods produce different flavors and preservation qualities. Hickory created strong, penetrating smoke ideal for large cuts of meat. Cedar provided antimicrobial properties that helped prevent spoilage. Fruit woods added subtle sweetness that complemented fish and poultry. The timing of smoking was critical and required reading environmental cues that modern cooks never consider. Humidity levels affected how smoke penetrated food. Wind direction determined how smoking structures needed to be oriented. Temperature fluctuations required constant adjustment of air vents and fuel sources. This wasn't passive cooking, where you could set a timer and walk away. It required constant attention, deep knowledge, and the kind of intuitive understanding that only comes from years of practice. But perhaps the most remarkable prehistoric cooking innovation was fermentation. Long before humans understood bacteria, or the science of fermentation, they discovered that certain foods became more digestible, more nutritious, and more flavorful when allowed to decompose in controlled ways. They learned to bury meat in specific types of earth that contained beneficial bacteria. They discovered that certain plant materials, when kept moist and warm, developed complex flavors and became easier to digest. Archaeological evidence suggests that fermented foods were being produced over 100,000 years ago. Fermented fish sauce, similar to what's used in modern Southeast Asian cuisine, was being made by coastal peoples who understood that controlled decomposition could create intense umami flavors that enhanced other foods. Fermented plant materials provided probiotics that aided digestion and created vitamins that weren't present in the raw ingredients. The containers used for fermentation were marvels of prehistoric engineering. Animal bladders cleaned and prepared to create airtight environments. Hollowed gourds sealed with tree resins. Carefully woven baskets lined with animal fat to prevent air infiltration. Each of these containers required specific preparation techniques and understanding of how different materials affected the fermentation process. Temperature control for fermentation was achieved through burial techniques that took advantage of the Earth's natural insulation properties. Foods were buried at specific depths where ground temperature remained constant. They were wrapped in materials that provided additional insulation or were positioned near hot springs, where geothermal heat provided consistent warmth. The timing of fermentation was judged not by clocks, but by smell, texture, and subtle visual cues that indicated when the process was complete. Seasonal food preparation represented another level of sophistication that required understanding natural cycles, resource availability, and long-term planning. Summer abundance had to be transformed into winter survival. Fresh fruits were dried using techniques that concentrated flavors while preventing spoilage. Nuts were processed to remove toxic compounds and increase digestibility. Root vegetables were cached in underground storage systems that maintained optimal temperature and humidity. The drying techniques developed by early humans were remarkably diverse and effective. Sun drying required understanding how to create optimal conditions while protecting food from insects and sudden weather changes. Air drying in shaded areas prevented the harsh effects of direct sunlight while still removing moisture. Smoke drying combined preservation with flavor enhancement. Each technique required different preparation methods, timing, and environmental conditions. Pemmican, the concentrated survival food of Native American peoples, represents the pinnacle of prehistoric food technology. This mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries created a nutrient-dense food that could last for years without spoilage. The preparation required perfect timing, precise ratios, and understanding of how different ingredients interacted during storage. Too much moisture, and the mixture would spoil. Too little fat, and it wouldn't bind properly. The wrong berries could introduce harmful bacteria or create off flavors. The grinding and pounding techniques used to prepare pemmican and similar foods required tools specifically designed for food processing. Stone mortars and pestles were carefully shaped to create optimal grinding surfaces. Wooden bowls were carved with specific dimensions that aided in mixing and processing. Even the techniques for using these tools required knowledge, passed down through generations, understanding of how different motions and pressures affected the final product. But beyond all these techniques, beyond the sophisticated understanding of fire and fermentation and preservation, there was something else that made prehistoric cooking truly remarkable. It was the understanding that food was more than fuel. It was culture. It was identity. It was the foundation of human society itself. The ways that food was prepared, shared, and consumed created bonds between individuals and groups that formed the basis of human civilization. And we're still only scratching the surface of this incredible story, because the techniques our ancestors developed weren't just about survival. They were about creating flavors, textures, and experiences that would echo through thousands of generations, influencing every meal you've ever eaten and every cooking technique still used today. The art of seasoning and flavoring in the prehistoric world reveals perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of early culinary knowledge. Without access to salt mines or spice markets, our ancestors became master botanists and chemists, developing an encyclopedic understanding of which plants, minerals, and natural compounds could transform bland sustenance into something approaching pleasure. This wasn't just about making food taste better, though that was certainly part of it. It was about creating the complex flavor profiles that would satisfy not just hunger, but the deeper human craving for sensory experience. Sea salt, where coastal access allowed, was harvested through techniques that required understanding tidal patterns, evaporation rates, and seasonal weather cycles. Coastal peoples learned to create shallow pools that would concentrate seawater during low tide, then carefully manage the evaporation process to produce crystallized salt. This wasn't a simple matter of leaving seawater in the sun. It required understanding how wind, humidity, and temperature affected evaporation rates, how to prevent contamination from sand and debris, and how to time the harvest for maximum yield. Inland populations developed equally sophisticated methods for obtaining salt from natural sources. They learned to identify salt-rich plants that could be burned to produce ash with high sodium content. They discovered underground salt deposits and developed techniques for extracting and purifying these minerals. Some groups learned to follow animal trails to natural salt licks, understanding that these locations provided not just salt, but other essential minerals that enhanced both flavor and nutrition. But salt was just the foundation of prehistoric seasoning. Early humans discovered that the natural world provided an incredible pharmacy of flavors, each with its own preparation requirements and optimal applications. Wild garlic and onions weren't just picked and used immediately. They required understanding of when to harvest for peak flavor, how to process them for different cooking applications, and how to preserve them for use throughout the year. Herbs and aromatic plants demanded even more sophisticated knowledge. Many plants that could provide incredible flavors were also potentially toxic if used incorrectly. The difference between medicine and poison often came down to dosage, preparation method, and timing of harvest. Early humans learned to identify dozens of different aromatic plants, understand their seasonal availability, and master the techniques needed to extract and concentrate their essential flavors. Wild mustard seeds required crushing or grinding to release their pungent oils. Tree saps and resins needed to be heated and processed to create sweet or aromatic compounds. Certain flowers and leaves had to be dried at specific temperatures to preserve their volatile oils. Others needed to be used fresh, or their flavors would disappear entirely. This knowledge wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in the careful observation and patient experimentation of countless generations. The techniques for extracting and concentrating flavors were remarkably sophisticated. Oil infusion, achieved by slowly heating aromatic plants and rendered animal fat, created concentrated flavor bases that could enhance other foods for months. Vinegar production, through controlled fermentation of fruit juices, provided both preservative and flavoring compounds. Even simple techniques like wrapping foods in aromatic leaves during cooking required understanding which plants would impart flavor without introducing toxins. Spice blending, though limited to naturally available ingredients, followed principles that modern chefs would recognize immediately. Complementary flavors were combined to create complex taste profiles. Bitter compounds were balanced with sweet ones. Pungent aromatics were moderated with mild herbs. The ratios and combinations weren't random. They were developed through countless meals, refined through trial and error, and passed down as carefully guarded knowledge. Regional variations in seasoning reflected not just what was available locally, but sophisticated understanding of how different flavor profiles complemented local food sources. Arctic peoples developed techniques using sea vegetables and marine plants that perfectly complemented fish and marine mammals. Desert dwellers mastered the use of cactus flowers and succulent plants that enhanced the flavors of small game and forage seeds. Forest peoples created complex spice blends from tree barks, nuts, and woodland herbs that transformed wild game and foraged plants. The preparation of these natural seasonings often required as much skill as cooking the food itself. Tree barks needed to be harvested at specific times when their flavor compounds were most concentrated. Seeds and nuts required roasting or grinding to release their essential oils. Roots and tubers often needed fermentation or aging to develop their full flavor potential. Even the tools used for processing seasonings required specialized knowledge and careful maintenance. Grinding stones for spice preparation were different from those used for grain processing. They required specific textures and mineral compositions that would enhance rather than contaminate the flavors being processed. Wooden mortars were carved from particular types of wood that wouldn't impart unwanted flavors. Even the techniques for cleaning and maintaining these tools affected the quality of the final seasonings. The storage and preservation of seasonings presented its own set of challenges and innovations. Many aromatic compounds are volatile and disappear quickly when exposed to air, light, or moisture. Early humans developed sophisticated storage techniques using sealed containers made from animal bladders, hollowed gourds lined with tree resins, and carefully prepared bark containers that created optimal storage environments. Some seasonings required aging or curing to develop their full potential. Fermented plant pastes, similar to modern fish sauce or soy sauce, were created through controlled decomposition that could take months or even years to complete. These processes required understanding of how different environmental conditions affected fermentation, how to prevent harmful bacteria while encouraging beneficial ones, and how to judge when the aging process was complete. The social aspects of seasoning and flavoring were just as important as the technical knowledge. The individuals who possessed the deepest understanding of plant identification, processing techniques, and flavor combinations often held positions of significant respect within their communities. This knowledge was considered valuable enough to be carefully guarded and selectively shared, creating the first specialized roles in food preparation. Trading networks developed around particularly prized seasonings and flavoring materials. Groups would travel great distances to obtain specific plants, minerals, or processing materials that weren't available in their home territories. These trade relationships often formed the foundation of larger social and political alliances, demonstrating how food preparation techniques influenced the development of human civilization itself. But the true artistry of prehistoric seasoning went beyond individual ingredients or techniques. It was about understanding how flavors worked together, how they enhanced or competed with each other, and how they could be combined to create eating experiences that satisfied not just nutritional needs, but emotional and social ones as well. The meals prepared around prehistoric fires weren't just fuel for survival. They were the foundation of human culture, the beginning of the long relationship between cooking and community that continues to define us today. The preservation techniques developed alongside these flavoring innovations were equally remarkable. Salt curing, smoking, and fermentation weren't just methods for making food last longer. They were ways of creating entirely new flavors and textures that expanded the range of human culinary experience. A piece of meat that had been salt cured and smoked didn't just last longer than fresh meat. It tasted completely different, providing new sensory experiences that added variety and pleasure to the prehistoric diet. The timing and sequencing of these preservation processes required understanding that went far beyond simple recipe following. The salt content needed to penetrate meat at specific rates to prevent spoilage while creating optimal texture. Smoking temperatures had to be maintained within narrow ranges to achieve preservation without overcooking. Fermentation processes needed to be monitored and adjusted based on environmental conditions that changed daily. These preservation techniques also created the first truly portable foods that could sustain long-distance travel and seasonal migrations. Properly prepared preserved foods could last for months without spoilage, enabling human groups to undertake journeys that would have been impossible with only fresh food sources. This mobility was crucial for human expansion into new territories and the development of trade networks that spread both genetic diversity and cultural knowledge. The nutritional understanding embedded in these preservation techniques was remarkably sophisticated. Early humans learned that certain preservation methods actually increased the nutritional value of foods. Fermentation created vitamins that weren't present in raw ingredients. Controlled drying concentrated nutrients while making them more bioavailable. Smoking not only preserved food, but also added compounds that had antimicrobial properties, reducing the risk of foodborne illness. The tools and equipment developed for food preservation represent some of the most ingenious technologies of the prehistoric world. Smoking racks that could be adjusted for different heights and temperatures, drying frames that maximized air circulation while protecting food from insects and weather, storage containers that created optimal environments for different types of preserved foods. Each of these innovations required understanding of materials science, environmental control, and long-term planning that demonstrates the sophisticated thinking of our ancestors. But perhaps most remarkably, these preservation techniques were often combined in complex sequences that created foods with multiple layers of flavor and texture. Meat might be first salt-cured, then cold-smoked, then dried, creating products that could last for years while providing concentrated nutrition and complex flavors. Fish might be fermented, then hot-smoked, then packed in rendered fat for storage, creating preserved foods that retained moisture and flavor while resisting spoilage. The knowledge required to master these complex preservation sequences was encyclopedic. Understanding which techniques worked best with different types of meat, fish, and plant materials. Knowing how environmental conditions affected each stage of the process. Recognizing the signs that indicated when each step was complete and when problems were developing. This wasn't knowledge that could be learned quickly or casually. It required years of apprenticeship and careful observation under the guidance of experienced practitioners. And through all of this innovation, experimentation, and gradual refinement, our ancestors were creating something far more significant than better ways to prepare food. They were laying the foundation for human culture itself, developing the techniques and traditions that would eventually become the cuisines we know today, the social rituals that still define how we gather and share meals, and the deep understanding of how food connects us to each other and to the natural world that sustains us. The development of cooking vessels represents one of the most ingenious leaps in prehistoric food technology, and it happened long before anyone dreamed of pottery or metalwork. When you have no pots, no pans, no ceramic dishes, how do you create containers that can hold liquid, withstand heat, and transform raw ingredients into complex meals? The answer reveals a level of innovation that would make modern engineers pause in admiration. Animal stomachs became the first pressure cookers. A deer or elk stomach, properly cleaned and prepared, could hold several gallons of liquid and withstand temperatures that would cook food thoroughly without melting or burning through. But preparing these natural vessels required techniques that were passed down through generations like precious secrets. The stomach had to be turned inside out, scraped clean of all tissue, then treated with specific plant compounds that would prevent it from decomposing during use. The process was meticulous and unforgiving. One mistake in preparation, and the entire container would fail during cooking, wasting not just the vessel, but potentially days' worth of gathered food. The stomach walls had to be stretched and worked while still fresh to maintain flexibility. They needed to be treated with tannins from oak bark or other plants to increase durability. Most crucially, they had to be tested gradually, starting with lukewarm water and slowly increasing temperature to ensure they wouldn't rupture when filled with boiling liquid. But stomachs were just the beginning. Prehistoric cooks discovered that large pieces of hide, when properly prepared and supported, could serve as temporary cooking vessels for stone boiling. A hide would be stretched over a framework of wooden poles, creating a basin that could hold water and food. Hot stones would be added to bring the contents to a boil, creating stews and soups that extracted maximum nutrition from bones, tough plant materials, and small pieces of meat that would be difficult to cook any other way. The engineering required for hide cooking was remarkable. The framework had to be strong enough to support the weight of water, food, and hot stones without collapsing. The hide had to be positioned so that it wouldn't sag too much when filled, which would make it impossible to retrieve the stones safely. Most importantly, the hide had to be thick enough to withstand the heat of the stones without burning through, but flexible enough to conform to the framework without tearing. Bark containers represented another level of sophistication entirely. Certain types of tree bark, when harvested at the right time and prepared correctly, could be shaped into waterproof vessels that were both lightweight and durable. Birch bark was particularly prized because it contained natural oils that made it water-resistant and gave it flexibility that allowed it to be folded and shaped without cracking. The techniques for harvesting and preparing bark containers required understanding tree biology, seasonal timing, and complex processing methods. Bark had to be removed during specific times of year when the sap was flowing and the bark would peel away cleanly. It needed to be harvested in large enough pieces to create useful vessels, which meant finding trees of the right age and size. The bark then had to be treated, shaped, and sealed using plant resins and careful stitching techniques that created watertight seams. Gourd vessels, in regions where they grew naturally, became some of the most versatile cooking containers of the prehistoric world. Large gourds could be hollowed out to create bowls, water containers, and even cooking pots that could withstand moderate heat. But preparing gourds for cooking use required understanding their growth cycles, proper curing techniques, and methods for cleaning and treating the interior surfaces. The process began in the field, with understanding which gourds were ready for harvest and which needed more time to develop properly. Gourds harvested too early would have thin walls that cracked easily. Those left too long would begin to rot from the inside. Once harvested, they needed to be cured in specific conditions that would dry the interior while maintaining the strength of the outer shell. Cleaning out the interior of a gourd required specialized tools and techniques. The seeds and pulp had to be removed completely, often through small openings that required patient scraping with specially shaped sticks or bone tools. The interior walls then needed to be scraped smooth and treated with compounds that would prevent bacterial growth and eliminate any remaining organic matter that might cause spoilage. Some of the most ingenious prehistoric cooking vessels were created from materials that seem impossible for the task. Large leaves, when properly selected and prepared, could serve as temporary cooking containers for steaming delicate foods. Certain leaves contain natural compounds that make them heat-resistant and waterproof enough for short-term cooking applications. The knowledge required to use leaves as cooking vessels was incredibly specific. Different leaves had different heat tolerances, water resistance properties, and flavors that they would impart to food. Some leaves needed to be heated briefly before use to activate their waterproofing compounds. Others required careful handling to prevent tearing during food preparation. The timing of harvest was crucial, as leaves that were too young would be fragile while those that were too mature would be tough and might impart bitter flavors. Clay vessels, when natural clay deposits were available, represented the pinnacle of prehistoric container technology. But creating functional pottery without kilns, without potter's wheels, and without any of the tools we associate with ceramic production required techniques that modern potters spend years learning to master. The clay itself had to be carefully selected and prepared. Not all clay is suitable for pottery making. The clay needed to have the right plasticity to be shaped without cracking, the right composition to withstand firing, and the right texture to create vessels that wouldn't be too heavy or too fragile for practical use. Finding and preparing suitable clay often involved traveling to specific locations and understanding the geological conditions that created workable deposits. Shaping clay vessels without a potter's wheel required techniques that used the entire body as a tool. Coil building, where long ropes of clay are wound and joined to create vessel walls, required understanding how thick each coil should be, how to join them so they wouldn't separate during drying, and how to smooth the surfaces to create functional cooking containers. The firing process was perhaps the most challenging aspect of prehistoric pottery making. Without kilns, early potters had to create firing environments using open fires and careful arrangement of fuel and pottery. The temperature had to be hot enough to transform the clay into ceramic, but not so hot that the vessels would crack or warp. The firing had to be maintained for the right amount of time, with careful control of airflow to create the chemical conditions necessary for proper ceramic formation. Understanding when pottery was properly fired required recognizing subtle changes in color, sound, and even smell that indicated the clay had undergone the chemical transformation from plastic material to hard ceramic. Underfired pottery would absorb water and eventually dissolve. Overfired pottery would become brittle and crack easily. The margin for error was small, and the consequences of failure meant losing not just the vessel, but all the time and effort invested in gathering materials and shaping the pottery. But beyond the technical challenges of creating cooking vessels, prehistoric food preparation required understanding how different container materials affected the flavor and nutrition of food. Clay vessels imparted different flavors than bark containers. Stomach vessels created different cooking environments than hide basins. Each type of container required different cooking techniques and produced different results. The choice of cooking vessel wasn't just about what was available. It was about understanding which container would produce the best results for specific types of food. Fatty meats cooked differently in waterproof containers than in porous clay vessels. Acidic foods could react with certain container materials, affecting both flavor and safety. Plant materials release different compounds depending on the cooking environment and container materials. Storage vessels presented their own set of challenges and innovations. Food that was carefully prepared and cooked could be ruined if stored improperly. Different types of preserved foods required different storage environments, and the containers used for storage had to be designed to create these specific conditions. Underground storage pits, lined with bark or hide, and sealed with clay or stone, created cool, consistent environments that could preserve certain foods for months. These storage systems required understanding soil conditions, drainage patterns, and seasonal temperature variations. They had to be positioned to avoid flooding during wet seasons, but deep enough to maintain stable temperatures during hot weather. Above-ground storage containers needed to protect food from insects, rodents, and weather, while maintaining proper air circulation for foods that required ventilation. Baskets with tight weaves could keep out insects while allowing airflow. Sealed containers, made from animal bladders or specially prepared hides, could create airtight environments for foods that needed protection from moisture and oxygen. The knowledge required to create and maintain these storage systems was as complex as any cooking technique. Understanding which foods could be stored together and which needed separation. Knowing how to monitor stored foods for signs of spoilage and how to intervene before problems spread to entire food supplies. Recognizing the environmental conditions that promoted or prevented food spoilage and adjusting storage techniques accordingly. Perhaps most remarkably, prehistoric food storage often involved creating multiple backup systems and redundant supplies. Important foods would be stored using several different techniques in different locations, ensuring that if one storage system failed, the community wouldn't face starvation. This level of planning and risk management demonstrates the sophisticated thinking that our ancestors applied to every aspect of food preparation and preservation. The tools used for food preparation were as ingenious as the vessels and storage systems. Cutting implements made from stone, bone, and wood required understanding of how different materials held edges, how to maintain and repair them, and how to use them safely and effectively. Grinding stones for processing nuts, seeds, and grains had to be shaped to create optimal grinding surfaces and maintained to prevent contamination of food with stone particles. Even simple tools like wooden spoons and stirring sticks required careful selection of materials and understanding of how different woods affected food flavors. Some woods were naturally antimicrobial and helped prevent food spoilage. Others imparted pleasant flavors that enhanced certain dishes. Still others were avoided because they could make food bitter or even toxic. The maintenance and care of cooking tools was as important as their initial creation. Stone knives needed regular resharpening using specific techniques that maintained their edge geometry. Wooden tools required treatment with oils or other compounds that prevented cracking and bacterial growth. Storage of tools required protecting them from moisture, insects, and physical damage while keeping them accessible for daily use. But throughout all of this technological innovation, all of this sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques, there was something else happening that was perhaps even more important than the cooking itself. These tools, these techniques, these carefully guarded secrets of food preparation were creating the foundation of human culture and social organization. The act of sharing food, of gathering around the preparation of meals, created bonds that went far beyond simple nutrition. When multiple people worked together to dig earth ovens, to tend smoking fires, to process complex foods that required many hands and many hours, they weren't just making dinner, they were creating the social structures that would define human civilization for millennia to come. The knowledge required for successful food preparation couldn't be hoarded by individuals. It had to be shared, taught, demonstrated, and passed down through generations. This created the first educational systems, the first mentorship relationships, the first formal ways of transmitting complex information from one generation to the next. A young person learning to identify edible plants wasn't just acquiring survival skills. They were being inducted into a knowledge system that connected them to their ancestors and their community in profound ways. The seasonal rhythms of food preparation created the first calendars, the first ways of organizing time around something other than immediate survival needs. Communities had to coordinate their activities around the availability of different foods, the optimal times for processing and preservation, and the complex timing required for techniques like fermentation and earth oven cooking. This coordination required communication, planning, and social organization that became the foundation of more complex societies. Gender roles and social hierarchies often developed around food preparation expertise. Those who possessed the deepest knowledge of plant identification, cooking techniques, and preservation methods often held positions of significant respect and influence within their communities. This knowledge was power, and the ways it was shared or withheld shaped the social dynamics of prehistoric groups. The tools and techniques of food preparation also created some of the first trade relationships between different groups. Specialized materials, like particular types of stone for grinding, specific plants for seasoning or preservation, or unique clay deposits for pottery, became valuable trade goods that connected communities across vast distances. These trade networks carried not just materials, but also knowledge, techniques, and cultural practices that enriched the food traditions of participating groups. But perhaps most importantly, the act of transforming raw ingredients into prepared food represented a fundamental shift in how humans related to the natural world. No longer were they simply consumers of what nature provided. They had become active participants in transforming their environment, taking the raw materials of survival and turning them into something that satisfied not just physical needs, but emotional and social ones as well. The flavors, aromas, and textures created through prehistoric cooking techniques weren't accidents. They were the result of thousands of years of experimentation, refinement, and cultural transmission. The smoky sweetness of properly cooked meat, the complex flavors of fermented plant materials, the satisfying textures of foods that had been processed to maximize their nutritional value. These were the foundation of human cuisine, the beginning of our species' long love affair with flavor and food culture. The techniques developed by our ancestors didn't disappear when agriculture and civilization arrived. They evolved, became more sophisticated, and merged with new technologies to create the cooking traditions we know today. The smoking techniques used by prehistoric hunters became the barbecue traditions of the American South. The fermentation methods developed by ancient gatherers became the cheese, wine, and bread that define European cuisine. The spice combinations discovered by prehistoric foragers became the complex flavor profiles that characterize cuisines around the world. Even our modern cooking equipment carries the DNA of prehistoric innovations. The pressure cooker is a technological descendant of the animal stomach vessels used for stone boiling. The slow cooker recreates the gentle, long-term heat of earth oven cooking. The smoker is a direct evolution of the smoking structures built by our ancestors thousands of years ago. But beyond the techniques and tools, prehistoric food preparation gave us something even more valuable: the understanding that food is culture, that cooking is an act of creativity and love, that sharing meals is fundamental to what makes us human. Every time we gather around a table, every time we put care and attention into preparing food for others, every time we pass down family recipes or cooking techniques, we're participating in a tradition that stretches back to the first fires lit by our ancestors. The story of how prehistoric humans prepared their food isn't just ancient history, it's the foundation story of human civilization itself. The beginning of our species' journey from mere survival to the creation of culture, art, and meaning. Those early cooks, working with fire and stone and the plants and animals around them, weren't just feeding their families. They were creating the world we live in today. So the next time you light a fire, season your food, or share a meal with people you care about, remember that you're participating in something ancient and profound. You're continuing a conversation that began hundreds of thousands of years ago, around flickering flames, carrying forward traditions that have been passed down through an unbroken chain of human experience, adding your own chapter to the greatest story ever told, the story of how we learned to transform the raw materials of existence into something approaching joy. And in that transformation, in that endless creativity born from necessity, we find something that transcends mere survival. Because when those first humans discovered that certain combinations of smoke and thyme could turn tough meat into something tender and flavorful, when they learned that the right balance of salt and fermentation could create foods that lasted through the hardest winters, when they realized that sharing the labor of food preparation created bonds stronger than blood, they weren't just solving the problem of hunger, they were solving the problem of meaning itself. The archaeological record tells us that these innovations spread not through conquest or commerce, but through the simple human desire to make life better, more flavorful, more connected to others. A technique discovered by one group would slowly spread to neighboring communities, carried by marriages, migrations, and the basic human tendency to share knowledge that brings joy. The smoking method that worked perfectly for salmon in one river valley would be adapted for deer in another, then modified again for the preservation of gathered nuts and berries. This wasn't just technological transfer, it was cultural evolution in its purest form. Each adaptation, each modification, each small improvement represented thousands of individual decisions, experiments, and discoveries. A grandmother, noticing that meat wrapped in certain leaves tasted better than others. A hunter realizing that wood from storm-damaged trees burned differently than green wood. A child accidentally dropping berries into a cooking pot and discovering that they enhanced the flavor of everything else. The cumulative effect of these countless small innovations was staggering. By the time agriculture emerged and began to transform human society, our ancestors had already developed a sophisticated understanding of chemistry, biology, physics, and nutrition that would serve as the foundation for every culinary tradition that followed. They had learned to manipulate proteins, carbohydrates, and fats at a molecular level. They understood fermentation, preservation, and flavor enhancement in ways that modern food scientists are still discovering and documenting. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of prehistoric food preparation was its sustainability. These techniques were developed over hundreds of thousands of years of intimate relationship with local ecosystems. Every method, every ingredient, every tool was tested not just for effectiveness, but for long-term viability. Communities that over-harvested their resources or used techniques that damaged their environment simply didn't survive to pass on their knowledge. The wisdom embedded in these ancient practices represents a kind of intelligence that our modern world is desperately trying to rediscover. The understanding that food production must work in harmony with natural systems. The knowledge that the best flavors come from ingredients that are harvested at the right time, in the right way, from healthy ecosystems. The recognition that the act of preparing and sharing food is as important as the nutrition it provides. When we look at the current state of our food systems, with their industrial scale, their environmental costs, and their disconnection from the natural world, we might wonder what our ancestors would think. They who understood that every meal was a gift, that every successful hunt or harvest was a triumph to be celebrated, that the knowledge of how to transform raw ingredients into nourishment was precious beyond measure. Their legacy lives on, not just in the techniques we still use, but in the deeper understanding that food is never just about food. It's about identity, community, creativity, and our relationship with the world that sustains us. Every time we choose to cook a meal from scratch, rather than heating something pre-made, every time we gather ingredients from local sources, every time we share the labor of food preparation with others, we're honoring traditions that stretch back to the very beginning of human culture. The story of prehistoric food preparation is ultimately the story of human ingenuity in its purest form. Faced with the challenge of survival in a world that offered no guarantees, our ancestors didn't just endure, they innovated, they experimented, they created beauty and meaning from the basic necessity of eating. They turned the simple act of consuming calories into an art form that would define human culture for millennia. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps thinking about the meal you'll prepare tomorrow or the ingredients waiting in your kitchen, remember that you're part of this ancient story. Every technique you use, every flavor you create, every moment of satisfaction you find in a well-prepared meal connects you to that first human who discovered that food could be more than fuel, that cooking could be more than survival, that sharing a meal could transform strangers into family. The fire they lit still burns, the knowledge they discovered still guides us, and the deep human understanding that we are what we eat, how we prepare it, and who we share it with remains as true today as it was when our ancestors first gathered around those flickering flames, transforming the raw materials of existence into the foundation of civilization itself. The circle remains unbroken. From those first experimental bites of cooked meat to the meal you'll eat tomorrow, carrying forward the wisdom of countless generations who understood that in learning to feed ourselves well, we learn to be human.